The auctioneer's gavel trembled in his weathered hand as he surveyed the skeletal mare standing in the dusty ring. Ribs protruded like prison bars beneath her dull coat, and her head hung so low it nearly touched the ground. The crowd had already begun shuffling toward their trucks, their interest evaporating the moment they laid eyes on what looked more like a walking corpse than a horse. "Do I hear $10?" the auctioneer called out, his voice cracking with embarrassment. The silence stretched on, broken only by the buzz of flies circling the dying animal. Caspian Mulligan sat in the back row, his calloused fingers wrapped around the last $20 bill in his wallet. 3 months behind on his mortgage, with creditors calling daily and his small farm teetering on the edge of foreclosure. He had no business being at a horse auction. He'd come hoping to find cheap equipment, maybe a plow he could afford, not to watch this heartbreaking spectacle. The mare lifted her head for just a moment, and their eyes met across the dusty arena. Something flickered in those dark depths. Not resignation, but a spark that refused to die despite everything her body had endured. It reminded him of his own reflection these past months, beaten down, but not broken. Going once for $10, the auctioneer announced, already reaching for his papers to move on to the next lot. Caspian's hand shot up before his brain could stop it. $10 here? A murmur rippled through the remaining crowd. Someone actually wanted the dying horse. The auctioneer looked genuinely surprised but nodded. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $10. As Caspian made his way to the office to complete the paperwork, he caught fragments of whispered conversations. Fools throwing his money away. That nag won't last the week. Probably buying her for dog food. The auction clerk, a thin woman, with tired eyes, looked at him with something between pity and confusion. "You sure about this, mister? That horse ain't got much time left. Doc Branwell, who brought her in, said she's got maybe days, not weeks." Caspian signed the papers with a steady hand. Sometimes all any of us need is someone who believes we're worth saving. Loading the mare into his battered horse trailer proved challenging. She could barely walk, each step a monumental effort that left her trembling. But she tried, and that effort spoke volumes to Caspian. He'd learned something about fighting impossible odds on his failing farm. The 40-minute drive home felt like an eternity. Every pothole sent a jolt through the trailer, and he found himself driving slower than he'd ever driven in his life, afraid that each bump might be the one that finally broke the fragile creature behind him. When they finally arrived at his modest property, Caspian backed the trailer up to the small barn he'd built with his own hands 3 years earlier, back when his dreams still outweighed his debts. The structure wasn't much: 6 stalls, a small feed room, and a hayloft that leaked when it rained. But it was sturdy and warm. As he lowered the trailer gate, the mare stood motionless, as if gathering every ounce of strength for what came. Next, the late afternoon sun caught the dullness of her coat, revealing hints of what might once have been a rich chestnut color beneath the neglect and malnutrition. "Come on, girl," Caspian whispered, extending his hand slowly. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The first night was the longest of Caspian's life. He'd bedded down in the barn, spreading his sleeping bag on a hay bale where he could keep watch over the mare. He'd already begun calling Ember, named for that small spark he'd seen in her eyes at the auction. Every few hours he'd wake to check on her, terrified he'd find her gone. But each time she was still breathing, still fighting. Her respirations were shallow and labored, but steady. Dr. Hadley Prescott, the only veterinarian in 3 counties who still made house calls, had come out that first evening and delivered a brutal assessment. Severe malnutrition, possible kidney damage, and her left front legs got an old injury that never healed properly, Dr. Prescott had said, running her hands along Ember's trembling frame. "Honestly, Caspian, the kindest thing might be to put her down. She's suffering." But something in the way Ember had leaned into his touch when he'd first approached her stall told him she wasn't ready to give up. What would it take to save her? Hypothetically, Dr. Prescott had sighed, clearly thinking he was wasting his time and money he didn't have. Round-the-clock care for at least 2 weeks. Special feed, supplements, antibiotics for the respiratory infection I'm hearing in her lungs. Warm compresses for that leg twice daily. Even then, her chances are maybe 20%. And that's being generous. The medications alone would cost more than Caspian had in his account, but he'd nodded anyway. Do whatever you can. The next 2 weeks blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and small victories. Caspian moved his bedroll permanently into the barn, sleeping in 2-hour stretches between feeding schedules. He'd researched everything he could about equine rehabilitation, calling in favors from neighbors who thought he'd lost his mind. Ember couldn't keep much food down at first. Everything had to be introduced slowly, carefully. Handfuls of soaked hay pellets, electrolyte solutions administered with a syringe, vitamin supplements that cost more per dose than Caspian usually spent on groceries for himself in a day. On the 4th night, she finally lifted her head when he entered the stall. On the 7th, she took a shaky step toward him when he called her name. By the 10th day, she was eating from his hand, her dark eyes following his every movement with growing trust. The transformation wasn't just physical. As her body began to respond to the careful nutrition and medical care, something deeper was healing too. The defeated resignation in her posture gradually gave way to alert curiosity. She began nickering softly when she heard his footsteps approaching the barn each morning. Caspian's bank account emptied, then went into overdraft. His credit cards maxed out, covering the veterinary bills and specialized feed. When the mortgage company called threatening foreclosure, he sold his grandfather's pocket watch, the only thing of value he owned, to buy another month. You're bankrupting yourself over a horse that might not make it, his neighbor Quinlan Hart observed one afternoon, finding Caspian in the barn applying warm compresses to Ember's injured leg. Caspian didn't look up from his work. Sometimes the things worth saving are the ones everyone else has given up on. 3 weeks after the auction, Dr. Prescott returned for what was supposed to be Ember's final evaluation. She stood in the doorway of the stall, her professional demeanor cracking with amazement. The skeletal mare was gone, replaced by a horse who still had a long way to go but was undeniably alive. "I'll be damned," she whispered, running her hands along Ember's neck where muscle was finally beginning to develop. Her color's coming back, her lung sounds are clear, and she's put on at least 100 pounds. But the real miracle was in Ember's eyes. The spark Caspian had seen at the auction had grown into a flame, and when she looked at him now, it was with the devotion of a creature who knew she'd been saved not just from death, but from despair. By the 2-month mark, Ember had transformed from a dying skeleton into something approaching a normal horse, though still far from her full potential. Her chestnut coat had regained its luster, revealing intricate white markings around her legs and a distinctive blaze down her face that spoke of careful breeding somewhere in her past. Caspian had begun taking her on short walks around his property, both for exercise and to satisfy his growing curiosity about her background. She moved with an unusual grace despite her lingering limp, and there was something in the way she carried herself that suggested she'd once been much more than a neglected pasture horse. It was during one of these walks that Caspian noticed Ember's reaction to the sound of his neighbor's motorcycle backfiring in the distance. Most horses would have spooked, but Ember simply turned her head toward the sound with alert interest, her ears pricked forward. No fear, just controlled awareness. "You've been trained, haven't you, girl?" he murmured, running his hand along her neck. "Question is, trained for what?" The answer came unexpectedly on a humid Tuesday morning when old Maverick Thornfield stopped by the farm. Maverick was something of a local legend, a former horse trainer who'd worked with some of the finest racing stables on the East Coast before retiring to the area 15 years earlier. "Heard you bought yourself a horse at auction," Maverick said, his sharp eyes taking in Ember as she grazed peacefully in the small paddock Caspian had fenced off near the barn. "Mind if I take a look?" Caspian led Ember out, surprised when the usually skittish horse allowed the stranger to examine her without hesitation. Maverick's hands moved expertly over her frame, his expression growing more intense with each passing moment. "Son," Maverick said finally, his voice tight with excitement, Do you have any idea what you've got here? A horse I paid $10 for who was about to die. Maverick pointed to the distinctive white markings on Ember's legs. See these markings? And the way her head's shaped, the length of her neck? This mare's got thoroughbred blood, and good blood at that. He lifted her lips to examine her teeth. She's young too, maybe 6 or 7 years old. In her prime, or should be. He walked around to her left side, examining the old injury that still caused her slight limp. This leg injury, it's old but not permanent. With the right therapy, she could probably run sound again. Maverick looked up at Caspian with an expression that was part amazement, part concern. You need to find out where this horse came from. The research took weeks, but Caspian was nothing if not persistent. He started with the auction house, tracking down records and contacting previous owners. The trail led him through a series of increasingly disturbing discoveries about Ember's past. She'd been born at Willowbrook Farm, one of the most prestigious thoroughbred operations in Kentucky. Her registered name was Blazing Ember's Hope, and her bloodline traced back to some of the greatest racehorses in history. She'd been sold as a yearling for $150,000 to a trainer named Dmitry Kozlov, who specialized in developing young racing prospects. But somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. Kozlov's operation had been shut down 2 years later, amid allegations of animal cruelty and doping violations. The horses had been scattered to various auctions and dealers, many ending up in situations far removed from their blue-blooded beginnings. She was probably bounced around from owner to owner, Dr. Prescott explained when Caspian shared his findings. Each one looking for a quick profit, none willing to invest in proper care. By the time she ended up at that auction, she'd been forgotten completely. But Maverick had other ideas. If she's who you think she is, and if that leg can be properly rehabbed, you might have yourself a racehorse, Caspian. A real one. The suggestion seemed absurd. Caspian was a broke farmer who'd never been closer to a racetrack than watching the Kentucky Derby on his small television. But as he watched Ember move around the paddock, her stride becoming more fluid each day as her strength returned, he began to see what Maverick was seeing. There was power there, carefully contained but unmistakable. When she played in the pasture, her movements held a grace and speed that seemed almost otherworldly, and in her eyes that spark had grown into something that looked almost like anticipation, as if she was waiting for something. What would it take? Caspian asked Maverick one evening as they watched Ember grazing in the golden light of sunset. Time, money, and more faith than any sane person should have, Maverick replied. But if you're serious, I know some people who might be willing to help. The rehabilitation program Maverick designed was unlike anything Caspian had ever imagined. It began before dawn each day, with careful stretching exercises, followed by controlled walking sessions that gradually increased in duration and intensity. The old trainer had recruited 2 specialists, Dr. Miranda Fairweather, an equine sports medicine expert, and Joaquin Delacroix, a former jockey-turned-trainer who had a reputation for working miracles with damaged horses. The leg injury isn't as bad as it looks, Dr. Fairweather announced after a thorough examination 6 weeks into the program. It's an old tendon strain that was never properly treated. With targeted therapy and conditioning, she should regain full soundness. The financial strain on Caspian was enormous. He'd sold his pickup truck and was riding a borrowed bicycle to his part-time job at the grain elevator. His electricity had been shut off twice, and he was living on canned soup and peanut butter sandwiches. But every morning when he saw Ember, waiting for him at the paddock gate, her eyes bright with anticipation, he knew he was on the right path. The real breakthrough came 4 months into training. Joaquin had been working with Ember on basic exercises, trotting over ground poles, practicing lead changes, building the muscle memory that had been lost during her years of neglect. But it was clear she remembered more than anyone had expected. Watch. This, Joaquin called out one morning, settling into the saddle for what was supposed to be a routine training ride. Instead of the usual calm trot around the makeshift track they'd created in Caspian's largest field, Ember seemed to transform the moment she felt the familiar weight of a rider. Her head came up, her stride lengthened, and suddenly she was floating, across the ground with a grace that took everyone's breath away. The slight limp that had plagued her for months vanished completely, as muscle memory overrode old injuries. "Sweet Mother of God," Maverick whispered, his stopwatch clicking as Ember completed a lap that would have been respectable at any professional training facility. "She's not just sound, she's fast, really fast." Word of the miraculous recovery began to spread through the small racing community. Visitors started appearing at Caspian's farm, drawn by stories of the $10 horse who might be something special. Most came expecting to see an amateur's delusion, but left shaking their heads in amazement. Among the visitors was Cordelia Blackthorne, a racing journalist who'd been covering the sport for 30 years. She arrived skeptical and left convinced she was witnessing something unprecedented. "I've seen a lot of comeback stories," she told Caspian as they watched Ember cool down after a particularly impressive workout. "But nothing like this. This horse has the kind of natural ability that can't be taught, and somehow, despite everything she's been through, it's still there." The article Cordelia wrote for Thoroughbred Racing Weekly changed everything. Within a week of its publication, Caspian's phone was ringing constantly. Owners, trainers, and investors from across the country wanted to buy Ember, with offers starting at $100,000 and climbing from there. "You could solve all your financial problems tomorrow," Joaquin pointed out after fielding yet another call from a potential buyer. "That kind of money would save your farm and set you up for life." But Caspian found himself unable to consider selling. He'd watched Ember transform from a dying skeleton into a magnificent athlete, and more importantly, he'd seen the trust in her eyes grow stronger each day. She wasn't just his horse anymore, she was family. "She's not for sale," he told each caller, though some of the offers made his hands shake as he wrote them down. The real test came when Sterling Remington III, owner of one of the most successful racing stables in the country, flew in personally to make an offer. Standing in Caspian's modest barn, surrounded by the rustic simplicity of a small family farm, he looked completely out of place in his tailored suit. "I'll give you $500,000 for the mare," Remington said without preamble. "Cash? Today?" For a moment, Caspian couldn't breathe. $500,000 would solve every problem he'd ever had, with enough left over to live comfortably for years. But then he looked at Ember, standing quietly in her stall, and saw something in her expression that looked almost like concern, as if she understood what was being discussed. "Mr. Remington," Caspian said slowly, "I appreciate the offer, but she's not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." The decision to enter Ember in actual competition wasn't made lightly. Despite her remarkable progress, she was still an unknown quantity against horses that had been professionally trained their entire lives. But Joaquin had convinced Caspian that she needed to test herself against real competition to reach her full potential. "There's a claiming race at Laurel Park next month," Joaquin suggested over breakfast one morning. "Low purse, nothing prestigious, but it would give us a chance to see how she handles race conditions without throwing her to the wolves." The claiming race was perfect for their purposes, a contest for horses valued at $25,000 or less, meaning any horse entered could be purchased for that amount by other owners. It would be Ember's introduction to competitive racing, and potentially her farewell if someone decided to claim her. The 6 weeks of preparation were intense. Ember's training ramped up to professional levels, with daily gallops, gait practice, and exposure to the sights and sounds she'd encounter at the track. Throughout it all, she seemed to grow more confident, as if she was finally remembering who she was meant to be. Caspian had never been to a racetrack before, and walking into Laurel Park on race day was overwhelming. The sounds, smells, and energy of a live racing venue were unlike anything he'd experienced, but Ember took it all in stride, her ears pricked forward with interest rather than fear. In the paddock before the race, she looked magnificent. Her coat gleamed like burnished copper, and the muscle definition that months of careful conditioning had built was evident in every line of her body. Other owners and trainers took notice, whispering among themselves about the unknown mare and her unlikely connections. "She looks ready," Joaquin said, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. "Trust her instincts out there. She knows more about this than any of us." The field for the claiming race was typical of the class. 7 horses with various issues that had prevented them from competing at higher levels. As they loaded into the starting gate, Ember was 8-1 on the odds board, largely ignored by bettors who had no idea of her background or potential. When the gates opened, Ember broke cleanly, but settled toward the back of the field as Joaquin had planned. The strategy was to let her find her rhythm and make her move in the stretch, avoiding the early speed duels that could tire her out. But as they rounded the far turn, something magical happened. Ember began to accelerate with a fluid power that surprised even Joaquin. She swept past horse after horse with such ease that it looked effortless, her stride extending to cover ground in a way that defied physics. With a quarter mile to go, she was 4th. With an 1/8 of a mile remaining, she was 2nd. And in the final 100 yards, she pulled away from the field with an authority that left the small crowd stunned into silence. Caspian found himself crying as Ember crossed the finish line, 3 lengths ahead of her nearest competitor. Her time, just 2/5 of a second off the track record for the distance. The $10 horse had just announced herself to the racing world in the most emphatic way possible. The winner's circle ceremony was surreal. As they draped the blanket of flowers over Ember's back and handed Caspian the winner's trophy, he kept thinking about that skeletal mare standing in the auction ring 8 months earlier. The transformation seemed impossible, like something out of a fairy tale. But the real vindication came in the days following the race. Racing journalists who had initially been skeptical began calling Ember's victory one of the most remarkable comeback stories in the sport's history. Offers to buy her increased exponentially, with some reaching into 7 figures. "You could retire tomorrow," Maverick told him as they watched video of the race for the 10th time. "Never have to worry about money again." Caspian smiled, scratching Ember behind the ears as she dozed in her stall. "Money's never been the point. She chose me as much as I chose her. We're a team now." The racing world was watching, waiting to see what the $10 horse would do next. But for Caspian, the victory had already been won the day he'd seen that spark in a dying mare's eyes and decided she was worth saving. 2 years later, Ember's story had become the stuff of racing legend. She'd won 12 of her 15 starts, including the Grade 1 championship stakes at Arlington Park, a victory that officially established her as one of the premier horses in the country. But more than her racing success, it was the bond between horse and owner that captivated the public imagination. Caspian had turned down over $50 million in purchase offers, choosing instead to keep Ember and build something unprecedented, a racing operation founded on the principle that every horse deserved a chance to fulfill their potential. The Ember's Hope Foundation, named after his remarkable mare, had rescued and rehabilitated over 200 horses, many finding new careers in racing, showing, or simply as beloved companions. The modest farm that had nearly been foreclosed upon was now a state-of-the-art training facility. But Caspian had insisted on keeping the original barn, where Ember had fought for her life those first crucial weeks. It served as a reminder of where their journey had begun, and the power of refusing to give up on something worth saving. On a crisp October morning, as golden leaves swirled around the paddocks where dozens of rescued horses grazed peacefully, Caspian stood watching Ember with her 3-month-old foal. The colt, sired by a champion stallion who'd been donated to their breeding program, showed every sign of inheriting his mother's exceptional ability. "Hard to believe it all started with $10, Dr. Prescott observed, joining him at the fence. She'd become the foundation's head veterinarian, overseeing the care of all their rescues. Caspian smiled, remembering that first night in the barn when he'd wondered if Ember would survive until morning. "Best investment I ever made, though I didn't know it at the time." The foundation had attracted support from across the racing industry. Joaquin had become their head trainer, and Maverick served as advisor emeritus, sharing his decades of experience with the young horses they brought in. Even Sterling Remington III had become a major donor, admitting that he'd learned something valuable the day Caspian had turned down his $500,000 offer. "Some things are worth more than money," Remington had said at the Foundation's annual gala. "What Caspian and Ember have proven is that with enough care and faith, any creature can exceed everyone's expectations of what's possible." The racing world had taken notice in other ways, too. Claiming races now regularly featured horses that had been written off by others, as trainers and owners began to recognize that apparent failure might just be potential waiting for the right opportunity. Ember's story had changed how people thought about second chances. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The auction house where Caspian had first seen Ember had established the $10 Hope Award, given annually to the person who'd shown the most compassion in rescuing a horse that others had given up on. The first recipient, naturally, had been Caspian himself, standing at the podium where that same auctioneer now worked as the Foundation's volunteer coordinator. He'd looked out at an audience of horse lovers and spoken from the heart. "Ember taught me that value isn't determined by what someone's willing to pay," he'd said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his words. "It's determined by what someone's willing to give. She gave me everything she had, even when she barely had anything left. The least I could do was give her the same in return." Now, watching Ember nuzzle her foal in the autumn sunshine, Caspian reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. The broke farmer who'd scraped together $10 for a dying horse had become one of the most respected figures in thoroughbred racing, not because of the money he'd made, but because of the lives he'd helped save. The phone in his pocket buzzed. Another call about a horse that needed help. Another chance to prove that no creature was beyond redemption, if someone was willing to believe in them. As he answered the call, Ember lifted her head and looked at him with those same intelligent eyes that had first caught his attention at the auction. In them, he still saw that spark that had refused to die, now burning bright enough to light the way for hundreds of other horses who just needed someone to see their potential. It had been the best $10 he'd ever spent, not because of what Ember had become, but because of what she'd taught him about the power of hope, determination, and unconditional love. The dying horse had become a champion, but more importantly, she'd become the catalyst for something far greater than racing victories, a movement that proved every life had value and every dream was worth fighting for.